And joining us in studio is Dr. Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. And Michael, I should also note, former Israeli combat soldier, and you also served in the IDF spokesperson's office, which may be relevant to this story. First, your reaction to the results of the U.S. investigation.
Oh, I think it's sort of a foreshadowing of the type of problems that the president will have during his visit. You're going to try to solve this to satisfy the Israelis. You're going to anger the Palestinians. You're going to try to satisfy the Palestinians. You're going to anger the Israelis. Taking a middle road maybe is the best road, but it's certainly not an ideal road. And at the end of the day, both Palestinians and Israelis can end up being alienated or antagonized. Certainly, if the president intends to go to Jerusalem, he purportedly wants to visit a Palestinian hospital, that will have ramifications in Israeli politics. If he visits the Western Wall, it'll have ramifications in Palestinian politics, maybe even in the domestic politics in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. It's very difficult to thread this needle here.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, we understand the Palestinians. Their argument all along has been this was an intentional shooting by the IDF. That wasn't the conclusion. What reason do Israelis have? Israel says, frankly, they don't know. They don't know who fired the bullet. It could have come from an IDF soldier. Certainly wasn't intentional. What does Israel have to be dissatisfied?
Well, frankly, I think along with expressing deep regret for the death of this journalist, Israelis have every right to be outraged by this entire episode. Since 1990, there have been 2,600 combat journalists killed in action, 700 by U.S. forces, 11 belong to Al Jazeera TV station. There hasn't been an investigation of a single one of them. And now we've had major investigations by CNN, by the New York Times, by the Washington Post, all finding Israel guilty to various degrees. You know, the Anti-defamation League, the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, all have a definition of anti-Semitism that says, you know, if you hold Israel to unique standards and single it out, that's by definition anti-Semitism. Well, Israel's being singled out here in a very, I think, blatant way. And then the United States comes along and conducts this investigation, and rather than just saying, hey, we can't conclude, we have no conclusive evidence, they pointed, well, it looks like in any case, an Israeli soldier fired this bullet, maybe not intentionally fired the bullet. That is I think, a gross violation of our sovereignty, of our military, of our judiciary. We're in the middle of an investigation here. And it recalls something that Menachem Begin said to the Reagan administration back in 1981. Israel's not a banana republic. Can you imagine, Calev, if Israel did something similar to an American soldier, an action of an American soldier? Well, we're a sovereign nation here, and I think it's unacceptable.
That would happen in the relationship of Israel to the United States.
Right, they're a bigger country, we're a smaller country. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it right.
But I'm just saying that there are obvious reasons why that doesn't happen. But where do you think it would go from here? Where do you think this? We know the Palestinians are certainly going to, and we'll get the Palestinian perspective in a few minutes. But where do you think overall this incident will go from here? Certainly, for example, in the United States, where they're on Capitol Hill, there have been some members of Congress, some prominent ones, that have wanted to see a very thorough investigation of the shooting.
I don't think it's going to go anywhere from here. I think, you know, the people will continue what they believe. The Palestinians, the Israelis will continue to believe. There will be an Israeli investigation. They'll make a conclusion. But what Israel has done here, through this finding or non-finding, as it were, by the United States, it's averted a political crisis in Israel. And I'll explain. We'll go back 6 years ago to the case of Elor Azaria, the Israeli soldier who shot a Palestinian terrorist who was incapacitated, had been shot on the street. Elor Azaria shot him, killed him, and that ignited a far-reaching political crisis in the state of Israel. It resulted in the resignation of the defense minister, a great reshuffling in government. If the United States had concluded that this bullet came from a specific gun, and that gun belonged to a member of an elite unit in the IDF, it would have been a huge outcry. It would have been a criminal investigation. And I bet that the right wing of the Israeli political spectrum would have rallied around that soldier, and the left would have been in a different position. And the government of Yair Lapid, the interim government now, would have been placed in a very, very difficult position as well. Israel has averted that. The United States has averted that. I think everybody who's involved, the president, the prime minister, will move on.
And what about those in the United States, for example? Some of those voices, for example, who have called for an investigation.
They got the investigation. They got the investigation. They got exactly what they weren't asking for a condemnation. They're asking for investigation. They got it. It was a fair investigation by all standards. I think they have to move on.
Briefly, Michael, because you served in the Army and you served in the IDF spokesman's office, what about the issue of journalists in combat zones? And we've seen that, fire zones in the West Bank, and the care that Israel has to, extra care Israel has to take in these circumstances.
And the greatest fear I had as a paratrooper was accidentally shooting a journalist. And they are very much they take risks that soldiers don't take. We used to look at some of these journalists who are reporting from war zones and think they were crazy. They'd be running out in the middle of a crossfire. Because that's how they get their stories. Their job is to get a story. Our job is to stay alive and defend the country. And so there's a great fear. And in battle, a very typical accident would be a cameraman who's carrying a camera on his shoulder, but looks from a distance of a soldier in the fog about, looks like a bazooka, looks like an anti-tank missile. That's very common. They wear helmets. They wear flak jackets. For a soldier, that's very difficult to see from a distance in the smoke where it says, TV or journalist on the flak jacket.